They emerged like a shadow in the heart of the Valley of Mexico, a civilization that turned hunger into power and despair into empire. The Aztecs were not only warriors, they were not only rulers, they were architects of a world where fear was law, where faith was written in blood, and where every beat of the war drum echoed as an inevitable omen. Who were these men who raised immense temples while the cries of sacrifice rose to the heavens? How did a people who began as nomads, rejected and despised, become the terror of all Mesoamerica? The historian Bernardino de Sahagún, in the monumental Florentine Codex, described the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan as a city so grand that it rivaled the great European metropolises. Yet behind the beauty of its avenues and canals, there lay a terrifying secret. A society sustained by human blood, a culture where war did not end on the battlefield, but upon the altar of sacrifice. The question that remains is inevitable. What made the Aztecs so feared? Was it their relentless military discipline, their faith that demanded beating hearts offered to the sun, or the brutal combination of religion and war that transformed every enemy into a future prisoner, a future sacrifice? While many peoples built empires through diplomacy or wealth, the Aztecs chose the path of sacred war. Every battle was fought not merely to conquer land, but to feed the gods. How can such devotion be explained? How can one understand a faith that transformed violence into ritual and fear into a psychological weapon? The Spanish chronicler Fray Diego Durán once wrote that the Mexica gloried not in killing their enemies on the field, but in capturing them alive, for it was in sacrifice that true honor lay. That was the essence of their power, an empire that did not merely defeat, but humiliated. And so, between fascination and terror begins the story we are about to unveil. An empire that rose upon lakes and blood, where every temple concealed a promise of death and every conquest left behind a trail of fear. The journey that begins now is more than a historical account. It is a descent into a world where fear was not an accident, but the very foundation of civilization. Before they were known as Lords of Terror, the Aztecs were merely wanderers, a people without land, without a homeland, and without a certain destiny. They called themselves Mexica, and their founding legend is as powerful as history itself. It is said that the god Huitzilopochtli commanded them to seek the Promised Land, a place where they would find an eagle perched upon a cactus devouring a serpent. That vision, according to the accounts preserved in the Codex Mendoza, would be the divine sign for the foundation of their great city. For many years, the Mexica were despised by the other peoples of the region. They were seen as barbarians, without noble roots, expelled from fertile lands and forced to survive in miserable conditions. Yet this marginalization did not weaken them. On the contrary, it forged within them an unrelenting spirit of survival. The Spanish chronicler Hernán Cortés himself, in his famous Cartas de Relación, Letters of Relation, observed that the Mexica possessed an almost supernatural discipline and that their ability to adapt was what made them formidable. When they finally found the sign of the eagle upon the cactus in the middle of Lake Texcoco, they did not see merely a place to live. They saw the promise of an empire. Upon waters and man-made islands called Chinampas, they raised Tenochtitlan, a city that defied both nature and destiny. But who were they in their essence? They were warriors, yes, but also ingenious farmers, shrewd merchants, and architects of one of the most complex societies of pre-Columbian America. Their myths were intertwined with their identity, and the belief that they were the chosen people destined to feed the sun set them apart from all others. Is it not striking to think how a people once rejected, considered unworthy, became the very center of power in all of Mesoamerica? What inner force guided them? Was it faith alone, or something darker and inevitable? The indigenous chronicles speak of a people who carried in their hearts both pride and fear. They knew their destiny was grand, but they also knew that every step forward would be bathed in blood. Among the Aztecs, identity and sacrifice walked side by side. Thus, the Mexica ceased to be wanderers without a home and became the core of a terrifying empire. And to understand how a humiliated people rose to such power, one must delve into the monumental structure of the Aztec Empire. From the heart of Lake Texcoco, there arose something that the Spaniards, centuries later, would call one of the greatest wonders of the world. Tenochtitlan was not merely a city, it was the living symbol of Aztec power. Hernán Cortés, in his second letter of relation, described it as large as Seville and Córdoba, with markets that gathered more than 40,000 people each day. Imagine that, a vibrant metropolis, sustained by canals, monumental temples, and vast plazas, built upon the water as if it were an extension of nature itself. The Aztec Empire, officially called the Triple Alliance, was born in the year 1428, when Tenochtitlan joined forces with Texcoco and Tlacopan. Yet in time, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan assumed command, transforming the alliance into their own hegemony. Through military conquest and strategic alliances, they came to control an immense network of city-states that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. What was most striking was not merely the size of the empire, but the way it was sustained. The conquered peoples were not simply defeated, they were bound to a strict system of tribute. Exotic goods such as quetzal feathers, precious stones, richly woven mantles, and foodstuffs were regularly delivered to Tenochtitlan. The Codex Mendoza details these tributes meticulously, revealing the vast reach of Aztec domination. But there was something far darker behind this structure. The empire did not seek only riches, it demanded lives. Many of the subjugated peoples were compelled to provide victims for ritual sacrifice, thus sustaining the religious and military machinery of the Mexica. Political power was inseparably bound to religious power, and the rulers were regarded as the chosen ones of the gods. The emperor, known as the Huitlatlani, the Great Speaker, was not only a political leader, he was the bridge between men and divinities, the embodiment of Aztec destiny. His words were not mere commands, they were divine decrees. How could any people resist an empire that blended faith, fear, and absolute power? The Aztec Empire rose not only through war, but through the conviction that its very existence was necessary for cosmic order. And it is precisely in this fusion of religion and power that we find the reason why Aztec terror was so profound. For the next step of this story leads us directly to the heart of their faith, the rituals, the sacrifices, and the religion that fed the empire. Hi everyone, a quick pause. Did you know that over 70% of you watching are not yet subscribed? Every subscription, like, and comment truly helps the channel keep bringing our mythology stories. If you enjoy the content, support us now. Thank you for your support, and let's return to the story. If there was one thing that made the Aztec Empire truly terrifying, it was its religion. To the Mexica, the cosmos was a constant battlefield where divine forces struggled for the survival of creation itself. And at the center of this struggle was the sun god Huitzilopochtli, who could continue his journey across the sky only if nourished with human blood. This was no metaphor, it was an unwavering belief. Without sacrifices, the sun would die, and with it, the world. This cosmic vision transformed every heart offered upon the altar into an act of universal salvation. How can one comprehend a faith so absolute, capable of legitimizing rivers of blood? The Spanish accounts were horrified by what they witnessed. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, companion of Cortés, wrote in his True History of the Conquest of New Spain that the temples of Tenochtitlan exuded an unbearable stench of human flesh and congealed blood. He described altars covered with still-beating hearts and stairways stained crimson. The ceremonies were public, grand, and meticulously designed to impress and terrorize. The victims, often prisoners of war, were brought to the top of the pyramid temples, where priests with obsidian blades would open their chests in mere seconds. The heart, still alive, was lifted toward the sun, while the body was hurled down the stairs. According to the Florentine Codex, during certain festivals, hundreds of victims were sacrificed in succession, a brutal display of power and devotion. But the sacrifice was not limited to hearts. There were rituals of flaying, in which the victim's skin was used in ceremonies to symbolize the renewal of life. There were also child sacrifices to the god Tlaloc, Lord of Rain, whose tears were seen as an omen of good harvests. The horror was sacred, the fear divinized. And if for the Aztecs this was the price of cosmic order, for their enemies it was a fate worse than death. To be captured meant not only to lose freedom, but to have one's body transformed into an offering, and one's blood into food for the gods. Thus, terror was not accidental. It was a religious, political, and psychological tool, a spectacle calculated to maintain order and crush resistance. And it is precisely this connection between religion and war that brings us to the next point: how the Aztecs turned the battlefield into an inevitable path towards sacrifice.
For the Aztecs, war was not merely a matter of territorial conquest or the expansion of power. It was a sacred duty, a direct extension of their faith. They call it Xochitl, the Flowering War, a poetic name for something terrible, battles whose true purpose was not to kill, but to capture. Prisoners were more valuable than the dead, for they represented future offerings to the gods. The Florentine Codex records that young Aztec warriors were trained from an early age to fight not with the intent to exterminate the enemy, but to subdue. Capturing opponents was proof of courage, discipline, and honor. A warrior who brought in living prisoners gained prestige, rose in rank, and drew closer to the military elite. This perspective transformed the battlefield into something unlike what we know today. The Aztecs did not seek immediate slaughter, but psychological control. For their enemies, defeat meant watching comrades dragged away alive, fully aware of the fate that awaited them on the altars of Tenochtitlan. What terror could be greater than fighting for not life, but for one's very soul? Emperor Moctezuma II, cited by Spanish chroniclers, insisted that each war was a necessary tribute to the gods. To refuse to fight was to condemn the cosmos to collapse. Thus, every military campaign became an offering on a grand scale. The Aztecs organized their troops into strict companies, each associated with a military order or divinity. Among the most feared were the jaguars and the eagles, warriors who wore skins and headdresses that transformed them into almost mythical figures. When they advanced upon the enemy, they were not merely soldiers, but living manifestations of supernatural power. As if that were not enough, the Aztecs cultivated ritual wars with neighboring peoples, called flower wars. These were planned battles whose sole purpose was to supply the temples with prisoners for sacrifice. The enemy knew they would be defeated and taken to the altars, yet the tradition continued, an inescapable cycle of fear and devotion. Aztec warfare, therefore, was not confined to the physical field. It was also a religious and psychological spectacle, a mechanism that held the entire empire together through terror. But there was something even more disturbing: the way the Aztecs wielded not only the sword, but the mind as a weapon. A game of power that transformed fear into submission.
While Aztec warfare destroyed bodies, psychological warfare destroyed spirits. The Aztec Empire understood that true power lay not only in the blade, but in the mind. Every action, every ritual, every display of strength had a single purpose: to instill a profound, almost instinctive fear in all who dared to challenge their authority. The Spanish chronicler Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, in his Florentine Codex, reports that conquered cities were deliberately left with altars where prisoners were sacrificed in full view of the public squares. Blood ran down the temple steps, visible from afar, as a silent warning. It was a clear message. To defy the empire meant paying with one's life and even more with one's soul. But Aztec terror was not limited to what could be seen. Their enemies were subjected to stories and rumors carefully spread. It was said that the Aztecs had oracles who predicted every movement of their adversaries, and that each prisoner's fate was sealed from the moment of capture. The fear of inevitability became as powerful as weapons themselves. The military and religious structure further reinforced this psychological pressure. Elite warriors, known as the jaguars and the eagles, paraded wearing animal skins and majestic headdresses, transforming into almost mythical figures. To neighboring peoples, they were not men, but gods of death. Every battle fought against them seemed less a fight and more an encounter with destiny. Even the survivors of conflicts carried the marks of humiliation. They were forced to deliver tributes, witness rituals, and obey commands that constantly reminded them they were under absolute control. The mind, then, became as imprisoned as the body. This strategic use of fear, combined with religion and sacrifice, solidified Aztec power in an almost inevitable manner. It was not only military victory that mattered, it was the psychological submission of entire cities. Terror spread like fire, infecting those who witnessed it and even those who only heard tales of the empire. And in a way, this was the essence of Aztec hegemony. The enemy did not need to be annihilated to be under control. It was enough for them to know what awaited them, to comprehend the almost divine power of the conquerors, to feel the inevitable chill of destiny. The next stage of the story reveals the other side of war, the weapons that made this empire so lethal, and how every blade, every club, every obsidian projectile completed the cycle of terror that kept the empire intact. The power of the Aztec Empire was not limited to faith or psychological terror alone. Every warrior carried with him instruments of death, meticulously designed to inflict pain and control the enemy. The wooden club with obsidian blades, known as the macuahuitl, could cut like a metal sword and was capable of decapitating with a single strike. Arrows, darts, and spears complemented the strategy. But the true effectiveness lay in the relentless training that transformed young warriors into precise and disciplined machines of combat. According to the Codex Mendoza, the Aztecs taught from an early age that each weapon was not merely a tool, but an extension of the god's will. Every strike, every arrow, every capture was a ritual act. It was the human body and the weapon fused in a choreography of fear and devotion. Survival alone was not enough. One had to understand that existence itself was subject to a greater, inevitable, and absolute system. But the Aztec legacy goes far beyond weapons and terror. Their cultural influence remains alive in the architecture, art, and customs of modern Mexico. Festivals, dances, symbols, and even culinary traditions carry echoes of a civilization that knew how to fuse beauty, sacrifice, and power. Every stone of the pyramids, every mural, every war mask served as a reminder that culture and fear could coexist, shaping societies for generations. And so, When reflecting on the Aztec Empire, an inevitable question arises. How did a people who began as wanderers and outcasts manage to create something so grand and at the same time so terrifying? Was fear the greatest instrument of power ever conceived? Or was absolute faith the most devastating force in human history? What we can learn from this civilization is that power and terror can walk hand in hand, that discipline, strategy, and belief can shape entire empires. But above all, the history of the Aztecs forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Fear is a universal weapon, and its effectiveness is as old as humanity itself. If you have been fascinated by this story and want to dive even deeper into cultures that shape the world with power, faith, and mystery, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Each episode is a journey through civilizations you could never have imagined, and you will not want to miss it.